My name is Riley Sterling, and I am 31 years old. For the better part of a decade, I was convinced that my existence was defined by the smell of cured meats and the rhythmic hum of a commercial refrigerator. You see, most people view their parents as a safety net, but mine were more like a heavy wool blanket soaked in water, suffocating, cold, and impossible to shake off. You were never meant to be a doctor, Riley. You're a waitress with a stethoscope hobby. Stop embarrassing this family and go back to the deli where you belong. My father, Arthur Sterling, spat those words at me while swirling a 2-ounce pour of Macallan 18-year-old Sherry Oak Highland single malt scotch, which retailed for exactly $140 a glass at the private club where he spent his Tuesday afternoons. He didn't even look at me when he said it. His eyes were fixed on the deep, polished grain of his mahogany desk, a massive piece of furniture that cost more than my entire 4-year undergraduate tuition at the University of Maryland. To him, I wasn't his firstborn daughter who had graduated magna cum laude with a degree in cellular biology. I was a smudge on the finish of his perfect high society life, a persistent stain that refused to be buffed away by his disapproval. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand the sheer weight of that insult, you have to understand the lie I lived in for 7 years. In the spring of my senior year of college, I was waiting for one thing: a thick white envelope from the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. It was my dream, my singular obsession. I had spent 4 years in a library, Carol, that smelled of stale coffee and floor wax, sacrificing every party and every spring break to ensure my MCAT scores were in the 99th percentile. When the rejection letter finally came, or rather, when no letter came at all and my father told me he had received a thin notification of my failure in the mail, my world collapsed. He told me I wasn't cut out for the pressure. He told me the admissions board saw right through my mediocrity, and because I was 24 and broken, I believed him. For the next 7 years, I was a prisoner of the Sterling Deli and Fine Foods, a greasy sandwich shop, as the locals called it, though my father insisted on the Fine Foods moniker to satisfy his ego. It was located on a busy corner in downtown Baltimore, where the rent was $8,400 a month and the humidity made the ham sweat in the display case. I worked 60-hour weeks. My schedule started at 5 a.m., hauling 40-pound crates of Boar's Head oven-gold turkey and Swiss cheese into the walk-in freezer that groaned with the effort of staying at 38 degrees Fahrenheit. My father paid me $12 an hour, under the table, of course, to help me avoid taxes, he claimed, though it really just meant I had no Social Security contributions and no paper trail of my life. While my peers were finishing residencies and buying houses in the suburbs, I was scrubbing mustard stains off Formica tables and smelling like vinegar and old dishwater. I lived in a 450-square-foot studio apartment on the edge of the city where the radiator hissed like a dying animal every time the temperature dropped below 40 degrees. My rent was $1,100, which meant that after my father's generous salary, I was barely left with enough to buy a gallon of milk and a bus pass. Every day, I would see him drive past the shop in his 2023 emerald green Bentley Bentayga, the tires kicking up slush onto my worn-out shoes. He would stop in occasionally, not to check on me, but to audit the register and remind me that without him, I'd be homeless. He loved the power he held over me, the way he had managed to turn a potential surgeon into a kitchen drudge. He would lean over the counter, the scent of his expensive Tom Ford Noir Extreme cologne clashing violently with the smell of the deep fryer, and tell me that the deli was my true calling. The contrast between us was a physical ache. My father lived in a 7-bedroom Georgian manor in Roland Park, a neighborhood where the lawns were manicured to a precise 2-inch height and the silence was expensive. He spent his weekends playing golf at the Elkridge Club, while I spent mine degreasing the industrial vents with a chemical cleaner that made my throat raw. I remember one specific Thanksgiving where my younger sister Claire, the golden child who had followed in his footsteps by doing absolutely nothing but marrying a real estate developer, complained that the vintage Krug champagne was slightly too warm. I was the one who had cooked the 20-pound heritage turkey, basted in herb butter I'd stayed up until midnight preparing, yet I wasn't allowed to sit at the main table because my hands looked like a laborer's. I sat in the kitchen, eating a dry roll, listening to the clinking of Waterford crystal and the sound of my father laughing about how he'd saved me from the embarrassment of failing out of medical school. But the universe has a way of balancing the scales, and sometimes that balance comes in the form of a man in a crisp blue uniform carrying a heavy leather satchel. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 10:14 a.m. The shop was quiet, the pre-lunch lull filled only by the sound of the overhead fan and the dripping of a leaky faucet in the back. I was restocking the beverage cooler with glass-bottled Mexican Coke when a man walked in. He wasn't a customer. He was a process server, his badge glinting under the fluorescent lights that flickered with a rhythmic, annoying buzz. He asked for Arthur Sterling. When I told him my father wasn't in, he looked at me with a pity that made my skin crawl. He didn't leave. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope. "Since you're the manager on record for the Sterling Corporation, you can accept service for the civil litigation," he said, his voice as cold as the marble floor. I took the envelope. My hands, calloused from years of gripping a serrated knife and scrubbing floors, shook as I tore the seal. I expected a health code violation or perhaps a tax dispute. What I found was a doorway into a past I thought was dead. Tucked behind a stack of legal summons was a weathered, yellowed piece of stationery with the Johns Hopkins crest embossed in gold at the top. It was dated 7 years ago. It wasn't a rejection. It was a congratulatory letter offering me a full tuition merit scholarship. It stated that because they hadn't heard back from me after multiple attempts to contact my primary address, my father's house, the offer had eventually been rescinded. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. The air in the deli suddenly felt too thick to breathe, smelling of stagnant grease and betrayal. My father hadn't just told me I was a failure, he had intercepted my future. He had stolen the letter, hidden the phone calls, and watched me drown in a sea of deli meat and despair for 7 years, all to keep me under his thumb. He had systematically destroyed my confidence and my career so he could have a cheap servant to run his business and a punching bag for his ego. The $140 glass of scotch he sipped, the $250,000 car he drove, the very mahogany desk he sat behind. It was all built on the back of the life he stole from me. I stood there for a long time, the paper crinkling in my grip. I looked at the deli, the chipped tiles, the stained aprons, the "Help Wanted" sign taped to the door. I thought about the thousands of hours I'd spent thinking I wasn't smart enough, the nights I'd cried myself to sleep in my freezing apartment because I thought I'd let my family down. And then, the grief turned into something else. It turned into a cold, clinical rage. I realized that the man in the blue uniform hadn't just brought me a lawsuit. He had brought me the matches to burn my father's world to the ground. I wasn't just Riley the waitress anymore. I was Riley the woman who knew exactly where the bodies were buried in the Sterling Corporation's tax returns, and I was the woman who was about to show Arthur Sterling what happens when you try to cage a person who was meant to fly. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the moment I walked out of that shop, leaving the meat slicer running and the front door wide open, and headed straight for the one place my father never thought I'd go, the district attorney's office. I walked 3 miles in the rain, my cheap polyester uniform sticking to my back, but I didn't feel the cold. All I felt was the weight of that 7-year-old letter in my pocket, a golden ticket that had arrived nearly a decade late, but was still valid enough to buy my freedom. Family isn't supposed to be a prison. It isn't supposed to be a transaction where your soul is the currency. My father thought he had turned me into a smudge, but he forgot that some stains are made of acid, and they eventually eat through everything you hold dear. I reached the courthouse, a massive stone structure that felt like a fortress of justice. I didn't care about the mud on my shoes or the fact that I looked like I'd just crawled out of a storm drain. I asked for the white-collar crime division. I told them I had information about the Sterling Deli and fine foods, about the off-the-books payments, the laundered cash from my father's real estate consulting, and the systematic fraud he had been committing to maintain his lifestyle in Roland Park. I gave them names, dates, and the location of the secondary ledger hidden inside the hollowed-out base of that precious mahogany desk. As I spoke, I felt the 7 years of grease and shame washing off me, replaced by the sharp, sterile clarity of a woman who finally remembered she was a doctor at heart. My father wanted me to be a waitress. I was about to perform the most precise surgery of my life, and I wasn't going to use any anesthesia. The moral of this story isn't about revenge, though revenge is a dish best served with a side of legal consequences and a complete asset forfeiture. It's about the fact that your worth is never something someone else gets to decide, especially not the people who are supposed to protect it. Family isn't blood. Family is the people who want to see you succeed even if it means they lose your shadow. Arthur Sterling was about to lose everything: his Bentley, his scotch, his country club membership, and most importantly, the daughter he thought he had broken. As the investigators started typing up my statement, I looked out the window at the Baltimore skyline, the gray clouds finally breaking to reveal a sliver of cold, bright sun. I was 31, I was broke, and I was technically unemployed. But for the first time in 7 years, I could breathe. The white coat was still waiting for me, even if the path to it was now paved with the wreckage of my father's empire. I was no longer a smudge, I was the storm. The contrast between my life and my brother Julian's was more than just a difference in lifestyle. It was a sickening, systemic erasure of my worth that played out in every dollar spent and every lie told. While I was waking up at 4:30 a.m. to the sound of garbage trucks screeching down the alleyway behind the Sterling Deli, Julian was living a life that felt like it had been scripted by a luxury travel magazine. My parents, Arthur and Madeline, had designated Julian as the family prodigy from the moment he managed to charm his way into a private medical school that charged a staggering $58,000 a year in tuition alone, a sum my father paid without a single blink of his manicured eyelids. To celebrate his admission, an admission that I now realize was likely lubricated by my father's donations to the university's building fund, they bought him a 2024 Ibis white Audi A6 with nougat brown leather interior and a panoramic sunroof that cost more than I had earned in the last 3 years combined. Julian didn't just live in Chicago. He occupied a glass-walled sanctuary in a high-rise in the Loop, where his monthly rent was $3,200, a cost my father covered under the guise of ensuring a stress-free study environment. From his balcony, he could see the shimmering expanse of Lake Michigan, while from my single window, I could see the rusted fire escape and a neon sign for a pawn shop that flickered with a rhythmic, headache-inducing buzz. My reality was a claustrophobic 380-square-foot studio apartment located directly above the deli's industrial kitchen, a space where the floorboards vibrated whenever the walk-in freezer's compressor kicked on and the air always carried a faint, inescapable scent of brine and old cooking oil. I didn't have an Audi. I had a 2009 Silver Frost Ford Focus with a leaking head gasket that hissed like a cornered snake every time I turned the ignition, and a passenger side door that only opened if you kicked the lower panel with just the right amount of force. My medical career consisted of wearing thrift store scrubs I had purchased for $4 apiece at a charity shop in Cherry Hill, which I wore while performing the grueling labor that kept the Sterling Empire afloat. I was the reliable one, the daughter who stayed behind to handle the $4,300 weekly inventory orders from Cisco and Boar's Head, meticulously counting crates of provolone and checking the temperature of vacuum-sealed pastrami while my fingers grew numb in the 40-degree chill of the refrigerator. I was the one who spent my Saturday nights scrubbing the industrial Hobart meat slicers, a dangerous and meticulous task that required me to disassemble the razor-sharp blades and scour away the accumulated fat and gristle with a wire brush and heavy-duty degreaser until my cuticles bled. While I was elbow-deep in gray dishwater, Julian's Instagram feed was a curated gallery of my father's filtered generosity, featuring high-resolution photos of him on chartered yacht parties in Lake Michigan, holding a bottle of Veuve Clicquot and laughing with people who didn't know the difference between a stethoscope and a tire pressure gauge. He was the future surgeon, the pride of the Sterling name, the one who was carrying the torch, while I was the girl who just didn't have the scores for medicine, a narrative my father repeated so often and with such conviction that it became a local gospel. At family gatherings, where the air was thick with the scent of expensive catering and the soft clink of silver on china, my father would lean back in his chair and sigh with a performative sadness, telling our relatives that it was a shame I didn't have Julian's natural intellect. He would explain that some people are simply built for the prestige of the operating room, while others are better suited for the honest, salt-of-the-earth work of the service industry, effectively branding me as a failure in front of the very people I had grown up wanting to impress. The injustice of it was a physical weight, a constant pressure in my chest that made it hard to swallow whenever I looked at the spreadsheets for the deli. I saw the numbers. I knew that the profit margins from my 60-hour work weeks were the very funds being funneled into Julian's rent and his Audi's insurance premiums. I was subsidizing my own displacement, working myself to the bone to pay for the education I had been told I wasn't smart enough to receive. I remember one Tuesday evening when the radiator in my studio finally gave out, leaving the room at a biting 52 degrees, and I had to wrap myself in 3 layers of blankets just to stop my teeth from chattering. I checked my phone to see a text from my mother asking if I could cover an extra shift on Sunday because Julian was stressed from midterms, and they wanted to fly him to a spa resort in Scottsdale for a long weekend to recharge. The cost of that flight alone would have fixed my car's head gasket and paid my heating bill for 3 months. But in the economy of the Sterling family, my survival was always secondary to Julian's comfort. I lived in a world of technical specifications and grim financial realities that my brother couldn't even fathom. I knew the exact cost of a 50-pound bag of onions and the precise amount of bleach required to sanitize a prep table to Maryland health code standards. I knew that my father's generosity in giving me a place to live was actually a tax write-off, as he listed my tiny, crumbling studio as an administrative office on his corporate filings to lower the deli's taxable income. Every aspect of my life was a calculated move in his game of social chess, and I was the pawn he was willing to sacrifice to keep his king and his prince on the board. He looked at my calloused hands and my tired eyes and saw a tool, an asset that didn't require maintenance or appreciation, only a steady supply of guilt and the occasional reminder of my supposed intellectual inferiority. I would sit at my small wooden table, the one I'd found on a curb and refinished myself, eating a sandwich made from the ends of the turkey breast that were too small to sell, and I would read my old biology textbooks by the light of a $20 floor lamp. I kept my mind sharp in the silence, memorizing the pathways of the cranial nerves and the complexities of the endocrine system while the city roared outside my window, a silent protest against the life I had been forced to accept. The psychological toll was perhaps the most expensive part of the whole ordeal. To be told for 7 years that you are a disappointment by the person who is supposed to be your primary champion is a form of slow-motion soul-crushing that no amount of manual labor can mask. My father used my failure as a cautionary tale, a way to exert control over me by making me feel indebted to him for saving me from the shame of being an unemployed med school dropout. He never mentioned that I had never actually been a student, only that I had failed to make the cut, a phrasing that left just enough ambiguity for people to assume I had flunked out rather than never having been given the chance to start. I watched as he handed Julian the keys to a life of respect and authority, while he handed me a bottle of Windex and a list of chores, all the while maintaining a smile that never reached his eyes, a smile that said he knew exactly what he had stolen from me, and he enjoyed the secret. But as I stood in that deli, year after year, I wasn't just cleaning. I was observing. I was learning the rhythm of my father's deceptions, the way he moved money between accounts to hide the deli's true profits from the IRS, and the way he signed documents with a flourish that hid the tremor in his hand. I was the reliable one, and that was his greatest mistake, because being reliable meant I was invisible. I was the one who saw the mail before he did, the one who handled the invoices, the one who knew which floorboards in his office creaked and which drawers stayed locked. He thought he was burying me under the weight of my own supposed mediocrity, but he was actually giving me the keys to his kingdom. He believed that by depriving me of a medical degree, he had deprived me of a brain, forgetting that a stethoscope is just a tool, but a sharp mind is a weapon. The smell of the deli, that heavy, cloying mix of roast beef and floor wax, became the scent of my resolve. Every time I heard the Audi's engine purr as Julian pulled into the driveway of the manor, a sound so vastly different from the rattling, wheezing cough of my Ford Focus, I felt the embers of my resentment glow a little brighter. I wasn't just waiting for my life to start. I was waiting for the moment the foundation of his lie would finally crack under the pressure of his own arrogance. I was 31 years old, a woman who had been treated like a servant in her own home, a woman who had been told she was a waitress with a hobby, but I was also a woman who knew the exact price of every lie my father had ever told. The $58,000 tuition, the $3,200 rent, the $140 scotch, it was all a debt he owed to the daughter he had tried to erase, and I was finally ready to collect the interest. Family isn't about who you share a last name with. It's about who has the integrity to look you in the eye and tell you the truth. And in the Sterling household, the only truth left was the one I was holding in my hand, ready to use like a scalpel. The betrayal reached its agonizing peak during the Sterling Deli's 40th anniversary celebration, an event my father had orchestrated with the calculated precision of a political campaign to cement his status as a pillar of the local business community. The party was held inside the deli itself, which had been transformed from a functional sandwich shop into a cramped, humid banquet hall for 65 guests, including several prominent members of the local Chamber of Commerce and the regional tax assessor my father had been courting for months. The air in the room was a nauseating, thick cocktail of cheap domestic lager being poured from plastic pitchers, and the heavy, cloying scent of the Arturo Fuente cigars that my father and his associates puffed on with an air of unearned importance. I spent the entire evening in a state of perpetual motion, my body aching from a 12-hour shift that had begun at dawn, wearing an apron stained with the juice of 100 sliced tomatoes and the inescapable pungent scent of yellow onions that seemed to have seeped into the very pores of my skin. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, clearing empty plastic cups and refilling platters of artisanal cheeses that I had spent 3 hours plating, while my brother Julian stood near the center of the room in a charcoal gray tailored suit that cost more than my car's entire engine. The moment that shattered the final remains of my daughterly devotion came when my father, Arthur Sterling, climbed onto a small wooden step stool near the industrial refrigerators and tapped a silver spoon against a glass of that same overpriced Macallan scotch to command the room's attention. He looked out over the crowd with a flushed, triumphant face, his eyes sparkling with the reflected light of the flickering fluorescent tubes above us, and began a speech that was supposed to be about the deli's history, but quickly devolved into a coronation for his chosen heir. He spoke of the Sterling legacy and the importance of breeding and intellect, and then, with a flourish of his hand that nearly spilled his drink, he raised a toast to Julian for carrying the family's intellectual torch into the hallowed halls of medicine. The crowd cheered, the sound of their applause echoing off the white-tiled walls like a series of sharp slaps, but it was what he said next that truly froze the blood in my veins. He turned his gaze toward me as I stood by the overflowing trash cans near the back exit and let out a short, mocking laugh that traveled through the room like a cold draft. "Riley's great with a mustard bottle, and we appreciate her keeping the floors shiny, but let's leave the brain surgery and the heavy thinking to the men in this family," he declared, his voice booming with a cruel, jovial confidence. The room erupted into a chorus of sycophantic laughter, a collective sound of 65 people agreeing that my life's work was a punchline, while I stood there paralyzed, clutching a half-empty bag of discarded napkins. I looked at my mother, Madeline, who was standing near the deli's front window in a silk blouse the color of expensive cream, and for a split second, I hoped for a flicker of maternal defense or even a sympathetic wince. Instead, she merely glanced down at her $9,000 Cartier Tank Française watch, adjusted the gold link bracelet, and nodded in silent, graceful agreement with my father's assessment of my worth. She didn't see a daughter who had sacrificed her 20s to keep the family business profitable. She saw a servant who was slightly overstaying her welcome at a high society function. In that moment, the heat of the industrial kitchen and the noise of the party faded into a high-pitched, ringing silence, and I felt my soul go cold, a crystalline layer of ice forming over every memory of affection I had ever held for them. I realized with a terrifying, liberating clarity that I was never a person to them. I was simply free labor, a biological asset to be depreciated until there was nothing left but bone and resentment. I stood there by those trash cans, the smell of decaying food and industrial-strength disinfectant swirling around me, and I looked at my hands, my rough, red, calloused hands that were stained with the permanent ink of inventory markers and the grease of 1,000 deli orders. These were the hands that had balanced the books when my father was too drunk to find the decimal point, the hands that had cleaned the grease traps when the plumbing backed up on Christmas Eve, and the hands that had meticulously saved every penny of my $12 an hour pittance in a hidden shoebox under my floorboards. My father thought I was a waitress with a stethoscope hobby, but as I watched him pat Julian on the back, I realized he had made a fatal error in judgment. He had mistaken my silence for stupidity and my reliability for a lack of ambition. He didn't realize that while I was fetching more lager and wiping down his mahogany desk, I was also cataloging every financial discrepancy, every forged signature on a health department waiver, and every diverted fund that had paid for Julian's Audi and my mother's Cartier watch. The technical reality of the Sterling Deli was far grimmer than the anniversary party suggested, and as I stood in the shadows of the back hallway, I began to mentally calculate the cost of my father's arrogance. I knew that the anniversary fund he was bragging about was actually a series of unpaid payroll taxes for the 3 immigrant kitchen workers he paid in cash and threatened with deportation if they ever spoke up. I knew that the building's insurance policy was predicated on a fire suppression system that hadn't been inspected since 2018 because my father didn't want to pay the $600 service fee. I looked at the local Chamber of Commerce members laughing at his jokes and realized that they were all complicit in a facade built on my exhaustion and Julian's unearned prestige. The contrast between the intellectual torch my brother was supposedly carrying and the reality of his life, a life of failing grades covered up by tutors and a clinical rotation he only passed because my father sponsored a new wing at the hospital, was a joke that was no longer funny. It was a malignancy, and I was the only one in the room with the diagnostic skills to see exactly how deep the cancer of their deception had spread. I felt a strange, detached sensation, as if I were watching the party from a great distance, observing the way the light glinted off the cheap plastic cutlery and the way my father's face turned an even deeper shade of purple as he moved on to his 4th glass of scotch. He was a man who believed that power was something you inherited or bought, never something you earned through the grit of your own character, and he looked at me and saw only the mustard bottle I was holding. He didn't see the woman who had spent her nights reading medical journals by the light of a flickering street lamp, nor did he see the woman who had secretly retaken her MCATs at a testing center 2 towns over and scored a 522 while he thought I was at a grocery wholesaler. He had spent 7 years trying to convince me that I was small, but in the cold silence of that betrayal, I realized I was the only giant in the room. The 40 years of history he was celebrating were 40 years of my family's slow moral decay, and the party wasn't a celebration. It was a wake for the person I used to be. The sound of the meat slicer in the back, which someone had left running during the speeches, hummed a low, steady B-flat, a mechanical dirge that matched the rhythm of my heart. I looked at the guest list on the counter, names of doctors, lawyers, and city officials, and I realized that by the time I was finished, every single one of those people would know the truth about Arthur Sterling. I wouldn't just be the girl who cleared their plates. I would be the woman who dismantled their hero. My mother's watch ticked away the seconds of their reign, each tiny click of the Swiss movement a countdown to the moment I would finally stop playing the role of the dutiful, reliable disappointment. Family isn't blood. Family isn't a toast given in a room full of strangers to a son who hasn't worked a day in his life. Family is a bond of mutual respect, and since that bond had been severed with the edge of a Scotch glass and a cruel joke, I was no longer bound by any obligation to protect them from their own crimes. I turned away from the crowd, walking back into the kitchen where the heat was a physical wall, and I didn't look back. I didn't need to see the rest of the party. I didn't need to hear the rest of the toasts. I knew exactly what I had to do. I went to the small, locked cabinet where the secondary ledger was kept, the one that recorded the actual cash flow of the deli, not the sanitized version my father showed the IRS, and I realized that he had left the key in the lock in his drunken haste to get to the party. It was a sign, a final bit of cosmic irony from a universe that was tired of watching me suffer. I took the ledger, tucked it under my arm, and walked out the back door into the cool, damp night air of Baltimore. The anniversary party continued behind me, the muffled sounds of laughter and clinking glasses fading as I walked toward my 2009 Ford Focus. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine wheezing as it struggled to turn over, and I looked at the deli one last time. It was just a building, a collection of bricks and bad memories, and I was finally ready to stop being the glue that held it together. I was 31 years old, my hands smelled like onions, and I was about to become the most expensive mistake Arthur Sterling ever made. The moral of the story is that you should never underestimate the person who cleans up your mess, because one day they might decide to show the world exactly what you're hiding under the rug. I drove away, the leaking head gasket trailing a faint plume of white smoke into the moonlight, a ghost leaving the graveyard of her own past, headed toward a future that no one in that room could have possibly imagined for a waitress with a mustard bottle. Everything changed on a rainy Tuesday at exactly 10:14 a.m., while the gray Baltimore sky was weeping a steady, rhythmic drizzle that blurred the windows of the Sterling Deli and turned the asphalt of the street into a dark, oil-slicked mirror. I was in the middle of a tedious inventory count of the condiment shelf, specifically recording the stock of 16-ounce jars of Grey Poupon Dijon mustard and heavy-duty jugs of Ken's Steakhouse ranch dressing, when the bell above the door chimed with its familiar tinny ring. It was Mr. Henderson, our mailman who had walked this same grueling downtown route for 22 years, his navy blue United States Postal Service windbreaker darkened by the rain, and his breath hitching slightly from the humidity. He didn't have the usual stack of bills or the glossy circulars for local hardware stores. Instead, he was clutching a heavy, weathered manila envelope that looked like it had been through a war zone, its edges frayed and the paper discolored to the shade of an old bone. He walked straight past the display case filled with sweating blocks of Swiss cheese and stopped right in front of me, looking at me with an expression that was a confusing mixture of bewilderment and profound apology. "Found this behind a metal sorting bin at the old distribution hub during the final decommission sweep, Riley. And when I saw the name and the return address, I knew I had to bring it to you personally because it's postmarked exactly 7 years ago," he said, his voice dropping to a low whisper as if he were delivering a ghost. I reached out with trembling hands, my fingers still cold from the refrigerator and smelling faintly of the industrial sanitizer I had used on the prep tables earlier that morning, and took the envelope from him. The weight of it was substantial, a physical presence that seemed to pulse with the energy of 1,000 missed opportunities and a lifetime of suppressed dreams. The return address in the upper left-hand corner was embossed in a dignified navy blue ink that sent a jolt of electricity straight to my heart. The Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, Office of Admissions, 733 North Broadway, Baltimore, Maryland. I felt the air leave my lungs in a sharp, ragged gasp as I looked at the destination address, which wasn't my cramped studio apartment or my college dorm, but rather my father's private executive office at the Sterling Corporation headquarters. The postmark was clear, despite the passage of nearly a decade, showing the date of April 12th, 2019, a day that I had spent crying in my bedroom because my father had told me he had checked the mail and there was nothing but a thin rejection slip for me. With my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, I tore the seal of the envelope, the sound of the ripping paper echoing through the quiet deli like a gunshot. Inside, protected by a secondary layer of heavy-duty cardstock, was a thick, cream-colored letter on official university stationery, signed by the Dean of Admissions. It didn't start with the polite regrets I had played over in my head for 7 years. It started with the word, "Congratulations," in a bold, sweeping script that seemed to mock the last decade of my life. I wasn't just accepted. The letter detailed my admission into the prestigious MD-PhD medical scientist training program, a dual-degree track reserved for the top fraction of a percent of applicants nationwide. Even more devastating was the secondary document clipped to the back, a financial aid award letter confirming a full-ride merit scholarship worth a staggering $240,000, covering every cent of tuition, lab fees, and even providing a generous monthly stipend for living expenses. My father had known. He had held this physical proof of my brilliance in his hands, felt the weight of my future in that very envelope, and he had chosen to shove it behind a stack of invoices or perhaps a bottle of his expensive scotch, intentionally burying my life to ensure he wouldn't lose the cheap, reliable manager of his sandwich shop. I walked out of the deli in a trance, the rain soaking through my thin polyester uniform within seconds. But I didn't care about the cold or the dampness as I climbed into the back of Mr. Henderson's delivery van, which was parked at the curb with its hazard lights blinking rhythmically. I sat on a stack of plastic mail crates, the smell of wet paper and exhaust fumes filling my nose, and I stared at that date. April 12th, 2019, doing the mental math that felt like a serrated blade across my soul. 2,555 days. My father had stolen 2,555 days of my life, each one of them a 24-hour cycle of grease, mustard, and the crushing weight of a false mediocrity he had manufactured for me. He had watched me struggle to pay my $1,100 rent, watched me drive a car with a failing engine, and watched me wither under his insults, all while he knew that I was a Johns Hopkins scholar with a $250,000 prize waiting for me just a few miles away. Every "you're not good enough" and every "stick to the mustard bottle" was a calculated lie designed to keep me in a cage of his own making, a prison built out of my own misplaced trust and his bottomless greed. The realization of the sheer scale of the theft was paralyzing. He hadn't just stolen a career, he had stolen my youth, my confidence, and the trajectory of my entire existence. While Julian was being pampered with $58,000 tuition payments and $3,000 a month apartments, I had been working for $12 an hour in a shop that I technically should have been far away from, studying the complexities of the human brain instead of the price of bulk ham. I looked at the rain hitting the windshield of the van and saw the reflection of a woman I barely recognized, a woman who had been gaslit into believing she was a failure by the very person who was supposed to be her protector. The $240,000 scholarship wasn't just money, it was the price tag my father had put on my soul, deciding that keeping his business running for less than minimum wage was worth more than his daughter's lifelong dream. He had traded my stethoscope for a meat slicer and my research for a cash register, and he had done it with a smile on his face every single time he sipped his Macallan 18. I sat there in the silence of the mail van, the only sound the steady beat of the rain on the roof, and I felt the last remnants of my grief transform into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. Arthur Sterling didn't just hide a letter, he committed a crime against my future, and the debt he owed me was now far beyond anything a simple apology could cover. I thought about the 60-hour weeks, the $4,300 weekly inventories I had managed with perfect precision, and the way I had scrubbed his floors until my knees were bruised, all while he held the key to my freedom in a locked drawer or a hidden file. He wanted a manager, but he had accidentally trained a master of logistics, a woman who knew every financial secret of his empire and who now had the ultimate motivation to dismantle it brick by brick. My name is Riley Sterling. I am 31 years old, and I have just realized that the last 7 years of my life were a heist orchestrated by my own father. As I stepped out of the van and back onto the wet sidewalk, the manila envelope tucked tightly under my arm like a shield, I looked at the Sterling deli and didn't see a legacy or a family business. I saw a crime scene. I saw the 22 years of Mr. Henderson's service as a testament to the truth finally coming to light. And I saw my own hands, no longer smelling of onions in my mind, but of the sterile, sharp potential of the surgeon I was always meant to be. My father thought he could steal 2,555 days and get away with it because he thought I was too broken to fight back. But he forgot that a person who has survived 7 years of his psychological warfare is the most dangerous opponent he could ever face. I wasn't going back inside to restock the mustard. I was going to find a phone, call a lawyer who specialized in fraud and conversion, and then I was going to make sure that for every day he stole from me, he would spend 10 answering for it in a court of law. Family isn't blood, and it certainly isn't the person who hides your wings so you're forced to walk behind them in the mud. Family is support, and since Arthur Sterling chose to be a warden instead of a father, he was about to find out exactly how it felt to lose everything he had spent those stolen days building. The moral of this moment, etched into the rainy Baltimore morning, is that the truth has a way of navigating even the most cluttered sorting bins of history to find its way home. You can hide a letter, you can forge a rejection, and you can bury a scholarship under a mountain of lies, but you cannot kill the inherent worth of a person who is determined to find out who they truly are. I stood in the rain, my cheap uniform soaked to the bone and my 2009 Ford Focus idling roughly in the alley. But for the first time in 7 years, I wasn't a waitress. I was a doctor who had just diagnosed the terminal illness of her father's ego, and I was more than ready to begin the procedure. The $240,000 was gone. The 7 years were spent, but the fire that letter ignited in my soul was worth more than the entire Sterling estate combined. Arthur Sterling wanted to keep me small so he could feel big, but he was about to learn that when you try to contain a storm, all you do is ensure that when the walls finally break, there will be nothing left of your world but splinters and regret. I walked toward my car, the letter held close to my heart, ready to drive into a future that was 7 years late, but more certain than it had ever been before. I didn't scream when the full weight of the betrayal finally settled into the marrow of my bones, because a scream is a momentary release of pressure, and what I felt required a permanent, calculated dismantling of the man who had stolen my life. Instead of wasting my breath on the damp Baltimore air, I drove my rattling Ford Focus straight to the heart of the city, toward a glass-walled skyscraper that reflected the gray skyline like a sheet of polished obsidian. I was there to meet Marcus Thorne, a man whose reputation in the legal community was less like an attorney and more like a scorched-earth tactician. His office was a minimalist sanctuary of chrome and white leather located on the 32nd floor, where the silence was so thick you could hear the blood rushing in your ears. I sat across from him, my thrift store scrubs looking like a smudge against his designer upholstery, and I handed him the manila envelope that contained my stolen 7 years. Marcus didn't flinch. He merely adjusted his gold cufflinks and listened as I laid out the financial and emotional architecture of the Sterling deli and fine foods. To secure his services, I handed over a cashier's check for $5,000, a sum that represented every single penny I had scraped together and hidden in my shoebox over the last year. A retainer that bought me the sharpest legal mind in Maryland and the promise of a reckoning that would leave no stone unturned. For the next 3 weeks, Marcus and I became forensic architects of my own misery, digging through 7 years of meticulously buried business records that my father thought were protected by my supposed incompetence. We didn't just look at the surface. We went into the digital cellar, subpoenaing the Sterling Corporation's private server and the encrypted spreadsheets hidden within the deli's point-of-sale system. We found the so-called employment contracts my father had forced me to sign under the guise of family loyalty, documents drafted with predatory vagueness that claimed I was an independent contractor while simultaneously demanding 60 hours of manual labor per week. As Marcus scrolled through the ledgers with a cold, clinical detachment, we discovered the most galling theft of all. My father had been pocketing every cent of my purported tax withholdings for nearly a decade. He hadn't just been paying me a pittance, he had been siphoning off a total of $42,800 in stolen wages, money he had categorized as administrative overhead, while I worried about whether I could afford to put a new set of tires on my car. It was a systematic financial execution, a way to ensure that I remained too poor to ever leave and too indebted to ever question the hand that was feeding me crumbs from my own table. The paper trail was a map of Arthur Sterling's soul, a place where greed had long ago replaced any vestige of paternal instinct. We spent hours in the quiet of Thorne's conference room, the hum of the high-end air filtration system, the only sound as we cross-referenced the USPS delivery confirmation from the Federal Archives with the dates on my father's personal calendar. The confirmation was the smoking gun, a digital signature from 7 years ago, April 14, 2019, showing that the Johns Hopkins manila envelope had been physically handed to the receptionist at the Sterling headquarters at 11:02 a.m., and subsequently signed for by my father's private secretary. This was no clerical error or sorting bin mishap. It was a deliberate interception of a federal document, a calculated move to prevent me from ever seeing the scholarship offer that would have removed me from his control. To solidify the case, I provided Marcus with the ultimate piece of leverage, a hidden digital recording I had captured on my phone during a late-night argument in the deli's back office just 3 days after I found the letter. In the recording, the sound of a heavy glass hitting the mahogany desk is audible, followed by my father's gravelly, scotch-soaked voice, admitting with chilling nonchalance that he had indeed received the mail and made the decision to discard it because he did what was best for the business. Listening to his voice played back in that sterile, glass-walled office was like watching a surgeon cut into a tumor without anesthesia. It was agonizing, but it was necessary for the cure. "You weren't ready for the world, Riley." His voice crackled through the high-end speakers, and the deli needed a manager who knew the inventory. I was protecting the legacy. The arrogance in his tone was suffocating, the sound of a man who truly believed that his daughter's life was a secondary asset to be managed for his own convenience. Marcus Thorne just nodded slowly, his pen scratching across a legal pad as he noted the exact timestamp of the confession. We weren't just looking for a settlement. We were building a cage made of evidence, a structure designed to trap a man who had spent 40 years believing he was above the law because he owned the building the law was written in. Every hour we spent in those records was an hour. I felt the weight of my past 7 years shifting, moving from my shoulders onto the legal briefs that would eventually crush the Sterling Empire. The technical specifications of the theft were staggering when laid out in black and white on the 32-inch monitors in the conference room. We calculated the interest on the stolen $42,000, the loss of potential earnings from a career in medicine that had been delayed by a decade, and the sheer statutory damages for the interception of the scholarship letter. I watched as the numbers climbed into the millions, a cold mathematical representation of the life I should have been living while I was scrubbing grease off industrial vents and smelling like vinegar. Marcus looked at me, his eyes sharp and unblinking, and asked if I was prepared for the fallout, reminding me that once we filed the civil litigation and the criminal complaints for wage theft and mail tampering, there would be no going back to the family dinner table. I looked out the window at the Baltimore harbor, at the ships moving slowly through the gray water, and I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known since I was 24 years old. There was no family table left to return to. There was only a crime scene and a daughter who was finally ready to call the authorities. We worked through the nights, fueled by cold coffee and a shared sense of impending justice, as Marcus's team drafted the complaints that would be served not just to my father, but to the board of directors of the Sterling Corporation and the regional office of the IRS. I provided the specific details that only a reliable manager would know: the exact location of the off-the-books ledgers, the names of the vendors who were paid in cash to avoid sales tax, and the digital keys to the hidden accounts my father used to fund Julian's Audi and my mother's jewelry. I was no longer the girl with the mustard bottle. I was the informant with the master key. I remembered the way my father had sipped that Macallan 18 at the anniversary party, the way he had laughed at the idea of me being a doctor, and I realized that every cent of that scotch had been paid for by the sweat of my brow and the theft of my scholarship. The contrast between his luxury and my struggle wasn't just unfair, it was a documented series of felony-level offenses, and I was going to ensure that the bill finally came due. As we finalized the filing, Marcus handed me a pen, a heavy Mont Blanc that felt like a scepter in my hand, and I signed my name to the bottom of the affidavit. Riley Sterling. I felt the power of those 14 letters, the weight of a woman who had finally reclaimed her identity from the man who tried to bury it. We were seeking the full restitution of the $240,000 scholarship, the $42,800 in stolen wages plus triple damages, and a full forensic audit of the Sterling Deli and its parent company. But more than the money, I was seeking the public destruction of the lie that had defined me for 2,500 days. I wanted the Chamber of Commerce and the guests from the 40th anniversary party to know that the intellectual torch my father boasted about was fueled by the stolen dreams of his eldest daughter. I wanted the world to see the smudge on the mahogany desk for what it actually was, the only part of the room that was actually clean. The moral of this chapter of my life, written in the ink of legal filings and the cold clarity of a downtown office, is that the people who try to keep you small are usually the ones who are most afraid of how large you actually are. My father didn't hide that letter because he thought I would fail. He hid it because he knew I would succeed and that my success would mean his loss of control. He was a warden who had grown comfortable in his prison, never realizing that the prisoner he was mocking was the one who had been studying the blueprints of the walls the entire time. Family isn't blood. Family is a covenant of trust, and when that trust is traded for $42,000 and a cheap manager, the covenant is not just broken, it is incinerated. I walked out of that glass building and back to my Ford Focus, the engine still leaking and the interior still smelling of the deli. But I didn't feel like a waitress anymore. I felt like a predator. And for the first time in 7 years, the rain felt like it was washing me clean instead of just soaking me through. The procedure had begun, the incisions were made, and Arthur Sterling had no idea that his daughter was about to perform the most extensive surgery of his life. The setup for my father's final act of grandiosity was nothing short of cinematic in its excess. A $15,000 gala held at the exclusive Hillcrest Country Club to celebrate Julian's supposed entry into his medical residency. The ballroom was a cavernous space of gold leaf and crystal chandeliers that hummed with the high society chatter of 120 guests, a curated list of Baltimore's elite including hospital administrators, local council members, and the very same Chamber of Commerce sycophants who had laughed at my expense just weeks prior. The air was thick with the scent of prime rib, expensive lilies, and the underlying metallic tang of old money, creating an atmosphere that felt heavy with the weight of the Sterling family's perceived prestige. My father, Arthur Sterling, sat at the massive head table, draped in a custom navy tuxedo that likely cost more than my annual rent, leaning back in his chair with a glass of Macallan 25 this time, a bottle that retailed for over $2,000, as he held court about the Sterling medical legacy and how Julian was the second coming of Hippocrates himself. He looked invigorated by the lie, his chest puffed out as he accepted handshakes and backslaps for his son's achievement, never once mentioning the daughter he had tried to bury in a sandwich shop or the fact that Julian's residency placement was as carefully bought and paid for as the floral centerpieces on the tables. I walked into the ballroom at exactly 8:30 p.m., the precise moment when the appetizers were being cleared and the room was settling in for the keynote toast. But I didn't enter through the service door near the kitchens as I had for a decade. I walked through the main mahogany double doors, the heels of my polished black pumps clicking with a sharp, rhythmic authority against the marble floors that echoed like the ticking of a clock. I was wearing a professional charcoal gray suit from Theory, a $900 investment I had made with the very last of my emergency savings, tailored so perfectly that it felt like armor against the judgment of the room. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, clinical bun, and my posture was no longer the hunched, defeated stance of a deli worker, but the upright, immovable presence of a woman who had finally found her footing on the truth. I wasn't carrying a silver tray of bacon-wrapped dates or a pitcher of water. Instead, I held a heavy, professional leather portfolio containing 120 copies of a 3-page document, printed on high-grade 24-pound bond paper that felt substantial and undeniable in my grip. The room didn't go silent immediately, but a wave of hushed confusion began to ripple through the tables as people realized I wasn't there to serve them. My mother, Madeline, was the first to notice, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth as she squinted at me through her designer glasses, her eyes widening as she recognized the daughter she had dismissed as a failure. I didn't look at her. I kept my gaze fixed on my father, whose face underwent a terrifying transformation from jovial triumph to a purple-hued mask of rage and panic. He stood up slowly, his hands gripping the edge of the white linen tablecloth so hard the silverware rattled. But before he could speak, before he could order the security guards to remove the embarrassment of the family, I began to move. With the calculated efficiency of the manager he had trained me to be, I started at the tables closest to the door, placing a copy of the document in front of every single guest, moving with a silence and speed that left no room for protest. The 3-page document was a masterpiece of forensic destruction, a condensed version of the evidence Marcus Thorne and I had spent weeks assembling. Page 1 was a high-resolution color scan of my 2019 Johns Hopkins MD-PhD acceptance letter, complete with the $240,000 scholarship award, clearly showing the date it was received and the signature of my father's personal secretary who had accepted the delivery. Page 2 was a side-by-side comparison of the deli's official tax returns and the secondary off-the-books ledger I had recovered, detailing the $42,800 in stolen wages my father had siphoned from my tax withholdings to fund the very Audi Julian had parked in the country club's VIP lot. Page 3 was the most lethal, a verbatim transcript of the recording where Arthur Sterling admitted to hiding my mail because he did what was best for the business, followed by a formal announcement that a civil RICO lawsuit and a criminal complaint for mail fraud and wage theft had been filed in the Maryland District Court at 4 p.m. that afternoon. As the guests began to scan the pages, the atmosphere in the ballroom shifted from celebratory to toxic in a matter of seconds. I watched as the chief of surgery from the local hospital, a man my father had been trying to impress for years, read the Johns Hopkins letter and then looked up at Julian with a mixture of pity and disgust, realizing that the Sterling legacy was built on the back of a felony. The sound of the paper rustling was like a swarm of locusts, a dry whispering noise that drowned out the soft jazz music playing over the speakers. My father's voice finally broke through the tension, a ragged, desperate snarl that lacked all of his usual authority. "Riley! Get out of here this instant! You're delusional! This is a private event!" he shouted, his face now a mottled shade of crimson that clashed violently with his navy tuxedo. But he didn't move toward me. He couldn't, because he knew that every person in that room was currently reading the proof of his cowardice and his greed. He looked at the copies of the ledger on the tables of his business associates and saw his social and professional standing disintegrating in real time. I reached the head table last, the final copy of the document held out in my hand like a scalpel. I didn't throw it. I placed it gently on his plate, right on top of the prime rib he hadn't yet touched. I leaned in close, the scent of his expensive scotch and the stale air of his lies hitting me one last time, and I spoke in a voice that was low, steady, and utterly devoid of the fear he had spent 7 years instilling in me. "You told everyone I didn't have the scores for medicine, Dad," I whispered. the words cutting through the silence of the head table where Julian sat frozen, his face pale and his mouth hanging open like a landed fish. But the truth is, I was a doctor the whole time. I just had to wait for the right moment to remove the cancer from this family. Enjoy the celebration. It's the last one you'll ever be able to afford. I looked at my mother, whose Cartier watch glinted under the chandelier, and saw the moment she realized that the luxury she traded her daughter's soul for was about to be seized by a court-ordered forensic audit. The contrast between my $900 suit and the $15,000 gala was the most honest thing in the room. I had paid for my seat at the table with 7 years of my life, while they had paid for theirs with stolen money and hidden letters. I felt a profound sense of lightness as I turned my back on them, walking back toward the mahogany doors with the same measured pace. I didn't need to stay for the screaming or the inevitable arrival of the club's security. The work was already done. The 120 copies were circulating like a virus through the crowd, ensuring that by morning there wouldn't be a single country club in the state that would take Arthur Sterling's call. I had taken his sterling medical legacy and exposed it as a common criminal enterprise, and I had done it using the very organizational skills and attention to detail he had exploited for $12 an hour. Family isn't blood. Family is the people who don't intercept your future to satisfy their own insecurities. My father thought he was the architect of my failure, but he was actually just the primary donor to my eventual triumph. As I stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the muffled chaos of the ballroom behind me, I didn't feel like a waitress, and I didn't even feel like the victim I had been for 2,500 days. I felt like a surgeon who had just completed the most difficult part of a life-saving operation, the part where you finally cut away the dead weight so the patient can breathe. My car was still a 2009 Ford Focus with a leaking head gasket, and my bank account was now nearly empty after paying Marcus Thorne and buying the suit. But for the first time in my adult life, the road ahead of me was clear. The $240,000 scholarship might have been rescinded years ago, but the woman who earned it was still standing, and she was no longer willing to hide her light behind a mustard bottle. Arthur Sterling's world was burning, and the fire I had started with 120 sets of 3-page documents was just the beginning of the heat he was going to feel. I drove away from the country club, the image of my father's trembling hands reflected in my rearview mirror, knowing that the real celebration was just beginning. And for once, I was the guest of honor. I walked straight to the microphone, the feedback from the speakers emitting a sharp metallic chirp that cut through the murmurs of the elite crowd like a surgeon's blade through soft tissue. The master of ceremonies, a man in a rented tuxedo who had been fluffing my father's ego all night, stepped back in confusion as I took command of the stage, my fingers gripping the cold steel of the mic stand with a strength I didn't know I possessed. I looked out at the sea of bewildered faces, at the shimmering silk dresses and the gold watches that represented the stolen labor of my youth, and I felt a sense of calm that was almost predatory in its stillness. I have a gift for the man who taught me everything I know about loyalty and the true cost of a family legacy, I said, my voice projecting through the high-end Bose surround sound system with a clarity that made several people at the front tables flinch. I gave a subtle nod to the waitstaff, men and women I had personally pulled aside earlier in the evening and tipped $50 each from my final hard-earned savings, and as if on cue, they began to move through the rows of tables with silver trays. But they weren't carrying the secondary course of Wagyu beef or glasses of chilled Chardonnay. They were distributing the 3-page document that detailed the systematic destruction of my life. The silence that followed was not just quiet, it was deafening, a vacuum of sound that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the ballroom as 120 of Baltimore's most influential citizens began to read the evidence of Arthur Sterling's shame. It wasn't a menu they were holding, but a high-resolution copy of my stolen 2019 Johns Hopkins MD-PhD acceptance letter, the USPS affidavit from the Federal Archives proving he had signed for it, and the formal civil lawsuit I had filed for $450,000 in damages, stolen wages, and lost career earnings. The only sound in the room for a full minute was the synchronized rustle of paper until a sudden, sharp explosion echoed off the marble floors. A wine glass had shattered at table 4, slipped from the trembling hand of a city councilman who realized he was witnessing the public execution of a dynasty. I turned my head slowly to look at my father, whose face had turned the deep, angry color of raw steak, the veins in his neck bulging against his silk bow tie as the reality of the situation finally breached the fortress of his arrogance. He looked like he wanted to lung for the stage, but his feet seemed rooted in the expensive carpet, pinned down by the weight of the 120 pairs of eyes that were now shifting from the documents to him with a mixture of horror and profound revulsion. "You stole 7 years of my life, Father," I told the room, my voice steady and devoid of the tears he likely expected, "because you were too small and too greedy to let your daughter be anything more than a tool for your deli." I watched as he tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but no sound came out except for a ragged, wet gasp that made the hospital administrators sitting nearby pull their chairs away from the head table. I looked directly into his bloodshot eyes and delivered the final blow, making sure the microphone captured every syllable for the recorded record. "You spent 2,500 days convincing me I was mediocre while you sat on a scholarship that was worth $250,000. And now I am taking it all back. I am taking the deli, I am taking the manor in Roland Park, and I am taking every shred of the reputation you spent 40 years building on a foundation of lies. The lawsuit we filed this afternoon isn't just about the money. It's a total forensic audit that will peel back the skin of the Sterling Corporation until there is nothing left but the rot underneath. And by the time Marcus Thorne is done with you, you won't be able to afford the scotch in your glass, let alone the legacy you promised your golden son." The contrast was absolute. Me, the daughter who had been good with a mustard bottle, standing in a $900 suit that represented my independence, and him, the great Arthur Sterling, collapsing into his chair as if the very air had been let out of his lungs. I looked over at Julian, the supposed prodigy who was currently clutching the copy of the USPS affidavit, his eyes darting between the document and our father's crumbling face. I saw the moment the realization hit him, the realization that his white Audi, his luxury apartment, and his medical career were all funded by the literal theft of his sister's future. To my surprise, Julian didn't defend him. He didn't say a word. He simply stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, and without looking back at the man who had bought him everything, he walked out of the ballroom, leaving his residency celebration to rot in the middle of the first course. The Sterling medical legacy, the one my father had toasted to just minutes before, didn't just stumble. It turned to ash in a matter of minutes, incinerated by the heat of the truth I had brought into the room. My mother sat perfectly still, her hand resting on her Cartier watch as if trying to shield the luxury from the impending storm. But she wouldn't look at me, and she certainly wouldn't look at the husband who had just been exposed as a common thief. The guests began to stand, not to applaud but to leave, whispering to each other in hurried, frantic tones as they distanced themselves from the radioactive wreckage of the Sterling name. I stood on that stage and watched the room empty, the waiters I had tipped standing by the doors like sentinels of justice, while my father remained slumped at the head table, surrounded by the discarded copies of his own crimes. He looked small for the first time in my life, not like a giant or a warden, but like a pathetic aging man who had gambled his soul for the sake of a sandwich shop and lost. I realized then that the $450,000 was just a number on a page. The real victory was the silence of that room and the look of utter defeat in his eyes when he realized he could no longer control the narrative of my life. As the last of the guests filtered out into the humid night, I stepped down from the stage, the heels of my shoes clicking with a finality that signaled the end of my tenure as a victim. I walked past the head table, not stopping to offer a word of comfort or a glance of pity, because 7 years of grease and mustard and psychological warfare had burned those emotions out of me. I was 31 years old, a woman who had been gaslit since her early 20s, and I was finally walking toward the life that had been waiting for me behind that metal sorting bin at the postal hub. I walked out of the Hillcrest Country Club, past the valet stand where the emerald green Bentley sat like a tombstone, and I got into my Ford Focus, which rattled and coughed as I started the engine. The head gasket was still leaking, and I still had less than $50 in my checking account, but as I drove away from the gold leaf ballroom, I felt like the wealthiest person on the planet. The moral of this story is that you can steal a person's time, you can steal their wages, and you can even try to steal their identity, but you can never truly own the spirit of someone who knows their own worth. Arthur Sterling thought he was the master of the Sterling Deli, but he was actually just the temporary guardian of a daughter who was always destined for something greater than his narrow, greedy vision could encompass. Family isn't blood. Family is a structure built on mutual respect and honesty, and when those are replaced by theft and manipulation, the structure doesn't just lean, it collapses. I am Riley Sterling, and though it took me 7 years longer than it should have, I am finally on my way to the white coat that was always mine to wear. The legacy of the Sterling family died that Tuesday night at the country club, but my legacy, the one earned in the silence and the struggle, was only just beginning to find its voice. I drove toward the hospital, toward the place where I would eventually save lives instead of slicing ham, and for the first time in 2,500 days, I didn't look in the rearview mirror to see if he was following me. I knew he was exactly where he belonged, lost in the ruins of the world he tried to build on my broken back. 6 months have passed since the night the gold leaf chandeliers of the Hillcrest Country Club bore witness to the absolute incineration of the Sterling name, and the landscape of my life has been reconstructed with a surgical precision that my father never thought I possessed. The Sterling Deli and fine foods, that greasy monument to my stolen youth where I spent 2,555 days counting slices of provolone and scrubbing floor drains, no longer belongs to the man who used it as my prison. To satisfy the terms of the settlement Marcus Thorne negotiated, a legal restructuring that stripped my father of his primary assets to cover the $450,000 in damages, stolen wages, and the interest on a decade of deception. The deli was sold to a national franchise for exactly $820,000. I watched from a distance as the iconic green and gold Sterling sign was taken down by a crane and replaced with a sterile corporate logo, a physical manifestation of the fact that the legacy Arthur Sterling so desperately tried to protect by burying my future was nothing more than a house of cards waiting for the right gust of truth. My father is no longer sipping $140 scotch in a 7-bedroom Georgian manor in Roland Park. Instead, he is residing in a cramped 2-bedroom rental apartment in a nondescript part of the city where the walls are thin enough to hear his neighbors' televisions, and the air carries the scent of stale cigarettes rather than Tom Ford cologne. He is currently the primary subject of an expansive Department of Labor investigation into his decades of wage theft and tax evasion, a process that is peeling back the layers of his financial life with the same cold, unyielding detail that I once used to count his inventory. The contrast between his current reality and mine is a testament to the fact that power built on the backs of others is a temporary illusion, while power built on one's own resilience is permanent. I am no longer wearing $4 thrift store scrubs or driving a Ford Focus with a leaking head gasket that threatened to strand me in the rain. Today, I am in the midst of my 2nd year of residency at a top 5 hospital, a prestigious institution where the floors are polished to a high-gloss finish and the air is filled with the purposeful, life-saving energy I was always meant to contribute to. I live in a 1,200-square-foot sun-drenched apartment on the 24th floor of a modern high-rise, a space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offer an unobstructed view of the Baltimore skyline and the harbor beyond. Every morning, I watch the sun rise over the city and reflect off the glass buildings, a daily reminder that the world is vast and that I am no longer a smudge on a mahogany desk, but a woman who has reclaimed her rightful place in it. The apartment costs me $3,400 a month, a sum I pay with my own hard-earned residence salary, a financial independence that feels more luxurious than any inheritance my father could have ever offered. My daily life is now measured in patient rounds, diagnostic puzzles, and the sharp, sterile clarity of the operating room rather than the price of bulk ham and the rhythmic thud of a meat slicer. When I walk down the hospital corridors, the sound of my clogs against the linoleum is a steady, confident beat, and the white coat I wear is heavy with the weight of my own accomplishments, not the expectations of a man who tried to hide my wings. There is a brass plate on the door of the residence lounge that bears my name, Dr. Riley Sterling, and every time I see it, I feel a quiet internal thrill of validation. I didn't need a family legacy to put my name on that door. I didn't need a father's approval or a brother's shadow to define my worth. I put it there with the truth, with the 7 years of hidden study, and with the courage to walk into a ballroom and demand the life that was stolen from me. The technical mastery I once applied to managing a failing deli is now applied to understanding the intricate pathways of human physiology, and I have found that the discipline I forged in the grease and the humidity of the sandwich shop has made me a more resilient, observant, and empathetic physician than I ever would have been had things come easily. The moral of this journey, now that the smoke has cleared and the legal battles have settled into a series of monthly restitution payments, is that family isn't blood. Family is a covenant of mutual growth and protection, and when that covenant is betrayed, the biological bond becomes an irrelevant piece of history. My father thought he was the architect of my life, believing he could control the narrative by withholding a piece of paper, but he failed to realize that the spirit of a person who is truly meant for a calling cannot be contained by a manila envelope. He tried to keep me under his thumb to satisfy his own ego and to ensure his own comfort, a classic act of psychological sabotage that backfired with a mathematical certainty. He is now learning the hard way that when you try to suppress the truth, you only ensure that when it finally breaks free, it will do so with the force of a tidal wave that levels everything in its path. Julian, the golden boy who was once the centerpiece of the Sterling medical legacy, has gone silent, his own career stalled by the realization that his foundation was built on the wreckage of my opportunities. He has to live with the knowledge that his luxury was the direct result of my deprivation, a psychological burden that no Audi or high-rise apartment can ever truly alleviate. I sit at my desk in my sun-drenched apartment, looking at the city below, and I no longer feel the cold, clinical rage that fueled my lawsuit. That rage has been replaced by a profound, peaceful sense of closure. I have my career, I have my dignity, and I have a future that belongs entirely to me. The $450,000 in damages was used to pay off the student loans I had to take out for my second chance at school, to secure my apartment, and to ensure that I will never again be in a position where I have to ask Arthur Sterling for a single cent. My name is on the door. My life is in my own hands, and the truth has finally set the record straight. Family isn't who shares your DNA, it's who stays to help you build your table, and for the first time in my life, I am the one deciding who gets a seat. The legacy of the Sterling family as it was once known is dead, but a new legacy, one of integrity, hard work, and the refusal to be silenced, has been born from its ashes. I am Dr. Riley Sterling, and I am finally, undeniably, home.